My name is Fred Marks. I'm going to be your moderator for the seminar. And this seminar is an interesting one. It's called Sharing Staff, Getting More for Your Money. We have two distinguished experts here that I'm going to ask some questions, and they'll respond to those questions. And then after they're finished, we'll open up a Q&A from the audience. So any questions you have, just hold them until the end. Our two panelists today, we have Richard Klein, who is a partner with the law firm Romer DeBas. And next to Richard, we have Giovanni Porta, who's the account executive for Tryon Real Estate Management, a management firm that serves New York City and the boroughs. So like I said, we're going to we have some questions for them, then we'll open up to the audience. And our first question is going to be for Giovanni. Giovanni, why might two or more buildings consider splitting the cost of a given employee? Let's see here.
Position?
Okay, yeah. Why might two or more buildings consider splitting the cost of a given employee position?
Hello, Giovanni Puerta with Tryon Real Estate Management. One of the most obvious reasons would be cost. In my example, we manage a property in Lower East Side Manhattan that was a 12-unit co-op, and they wanted a porter to be on site and be able to take care of their needs. A 12-unit co-op is just not going to be able to, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Is not going to be able to handle a full-time employee, union benefits, and things of that nature. So what was done in this neighborhood is we found a gentleman that actually lived on site, worked for another landlord, and had a flexible schedule, so he was able to take care of the property's needs for this particular cooperative in the morning. So we made it so that he'd work on our site from 8 to 2 in the afternoon, and the rest of the afternoon he was free to work for the other services. So bottom line is mitigation of expenses and the ability to have a kind of boutique service where the small property's needs are met without the costs of a union-style building.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is for our attorney, Richard Klein. Richard, what are some of the legal and liability-related considerations boards and building owners need to take into account when they think about sharing staff with another building?
Well, one of the issues that I think of right away is, let's say two buildings are sharing a superintendent, and the super is in one building doing work in an apartment, and he messes up and does something, and the ceiling comes down, and there's a flood, and everyone wants to start suing. Who are they going to sue? Because the super's employed by both buildings, potentially there could be a lawsuit against both buildings, and one building had nothing to do with this work, the apartment wasn't in their building, and yet they could potentially be on the hook for work that the super did because he's their employee as well. So that would be one of my concerns, liability issues, that have nothing to do with my building. It could be for something he or she did in another building, so that would be a concern of mine.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to Giovanni for the next question. From a management administrative perspective, what are the biggest challenges involved in sharing staff members?
Fred, I think you skipped question
Yes.
2. Talk about how payroll grievances.
Oh.
Do you want me to skip that? Or?
No, I have that as the next question.
Oh, you do? Okay. So actually a perfect segue from what Richard's comments were. I think some of the biggest challenges in my experience would be insurance coverage. Because to Richard's point, if there's an issue, if there's a lawsuit, who's paying for it? Now, my advice and in preparation for the seminar, I spoke to brokers that we work with, and they recommended that a 1099 be filled out for a person that's working for two entities, and that their job responsibilities are named and detailed, that their hours are clearly marked and defined so that there's no overlap. But then again, regardless of being on the 1099, a building should still have its own insurance coverage, workers' comp coverage, because a lot of times the misconception is that by putting someone on 1099, it absolves the building of any responsibility, which is not true. If someone were to get hurt, if someone were to mess up, the building that he's working in my estimation, I mean, Richard's a professional in that department, but I would think that that entity is the one who's going to end up paying the costs. So I think insurance coverage, employment contract detailing what they're responsible for, the hours they're responsible for, is probably one of the biggest challenges, and definitely something that should be put in front of the House Council so that there's the least amount of ability for issues to occur.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question for Richard Klein. Richard, what type of documents or paperwork should be in order between both the building and the shared employee to make sure that tax withholdings, benefits, et cetera, are properly addressed and covered?
Well, I guess they put Giovanni and I on the same panel because we're anticipating each other's questions, and we work well together. I mean, as Giovanni just said, obviously, you want to speak to your insurance company about insurance coverage. You would want to have very tight employment agreements to make sure for a super, a porter, whatever the staff member is, what hours he's going to be at each building. And the attorney and me would probably want to see some indemnification language that if something happens at one building, that building's indemnifying the other building from any responsibility since it didn't take place on their property. So those are some of the documents at the get-go that you would want to see in place.
Okay, our next question for Giovanni is, Giovanni, talk to us about how payroll, hours, possible grievances, et cetera, are dealt with when two or more buildings share one on-site employee.
Okay, so I kind of alluded to that in the previous question. Again, strongly recommend having the employee on a 1099. Regardless of that, having and making sure that the entity that's maintaining the super for those particular hours have workers' comp insurance. There's other avenues. You could possibly ask the employee, him or herself, to have workers' comp coverage for themselves, but a lot of times it becomes too costly, and you don't want to fall in the loophole where the employee's telling you they are going to get coverage, and you end up finding out that they don't. And if that happens, you are now on the hook for things like that. So prominently 1099 is probably the most important way to go, and confirming that that's being done, vetting, going through the proper vetting process and making sure that the employee has done their end of the bargain. So that's about it.
Okay, one last question, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for Q&A, and that's for Richard Klein. Richard, what staff positions from a legal, liability, and administrative perspective really don't lend themselves to being shared between two different buildings or communities?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if I really have a legal answer to that. I mean, administratively, it can be done. I think it's more of a practical answer. I think it depends on the individual and the two buildings or three buildings that are going to be doing it together. I mean, a superintendent who's responsible, is dedicated, who is good at keeping track of hours, logging his or her work. I mean, I think it depends on the individual. I don't know that there's a legal answer because any of those positions could be a problem if you don't have the right documentation in place and if you're not dealing with the right individuals and even the right buildings. So I would say that's more of a practical issue than a legal issue.
Okay. Can I take some questions from the audience? Just raise your hand if you have anything. Ma'am?
I was asking, the setup of sharing employees is mostly recommended for small buildings, or can be done in buildings with a lot of units also?
Well, I think typically it would be probably presented to smaller buildings because they have the financial reasons for wanting that, whereas a larger building can probably have their own super, and because of how many units are in the building, require a full-time super. But even with large buildings, I know many management companies will, in terms of buying supplies and things like that, will work together use their buildings together because they can get more of a discount. And then they pass that discount on to all the buildings.
And just to add to that too, in New York City, there's, I want to say it's between 12 or 16 units that after a certain amount, you have to have a full-time super there. So, I'm sorry, it's more than that. So, when you get into the bigger buildings like the Cooperator that you live in, it's not a question about sharing an employee. You're most likely going to need a couple of staff members. So.
Is there any issue with the union for the employees? Is there any issue when you share these employees? You don't find any issue?
I'm not hearing the question. If there's issue, if your building is not union, I don't think there should be an issue. If your building is union, you're trying to share union super. I don't think. I mean, I don't have the true answer, but I would think that 32BJ wouldn't be too happy about that. Yeah, I think there's mandates that say you need to have a union super working these hours at this specific location. Yeah, I think they make it so that it's very clear cut as to what the needs are.
I mean, the unions are trying to place workers into the building, so they're not going to want a building to have the opportunity to share.
Correct.
So,
How common is that practice?
that's a good, I mean, I represent about 50 co-ops and condos in the New York City area, and none of my buildings do that. So, and we do represent some smaller buildings, some of whom are even self-managed, and I haven't seen where there's, I mean, some of my buildings, if the super goes on vacation, or even if he's overworked, he might ask the porter down the block to help, shovel or something like that, but not anything formalized where they're actually sharing staff.
My firm manages about 2,400 doors, and that one particular building that I spoke about is the only example that I, particularly in my portfolio, have. So I would say not that often in my particular case.
Any more questions?
If you're trying to share staff or like some sort of special task, like shoveling snow is always going to have the porter down the street who does the whole block. Is that something that would require extra insurance or a 1099, or is that something that can be done just as an as-needed basis?
I think the question of insurance is if your employee's listed, if you have paperwork on them, your workers' comp should cover them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if they're not union, it's a whole different issue. But I would be concerned only because, like, if you're asking the guy down the block to shovel, and he didn't do a good job, and someone slips and falls, you want to be careful.
Any more questions? Okay, I want to thank our panel. Can we get a round of applause for them?
Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
They're both exhibiting, so if you want to talk to them now or stop at their booth.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, let's do it. Hey, thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's all right.